Corinthians is the earliest written testimony that Jesus rose from the dead. The Gospels were written, some of them at least, probably in the 60s AD, and perhaps John quite a bit later, 80s, 90s. But 1 Corinthians was written in 53 or 54 AD, we reckon. So we're only talking just over 20 years from the death of Jesus. That might seem like a long time, but that's well within a lifetime. And it's very easy to think that someone was writing who actually was close to the events that they were talking about. But of course, Paul is writing, and he wasn't claiming to have known Jesus during his life. His claim was quite different. But notice what Paul says in this passage. First of all, he says that the belief that Jesus had risen again is a foundational, shared Christian belief. This is 20 years after Jesus died. Paul says that this is of first importance. Not just something that you can take or leave, but absolutely essential. And if you read the rest of 1 Corinthians 15, you'll see that for him it was absolutely essential. If Jesus didn't rise, our faith is in vain. He says it's pointless. But it's also something that was shared. So later on in that chapter, he makes it clear that this is what all of the apostles preached. He says whether we preached it or one of the others, this is what all of us are saying. Not just Paul, but the other apostles. Paul didn't disagree with the other apostles on these core truths of the faith. They were preaching the same thing. And it was a tradition, notice that, I delivered it to you as of first importance, but they had already received it. They already knew it. They knew it, and Paul had received it from somewhere else. So they already knew these truths. So when Paul is writing this in 53 AD, he's talking back about a time in history when he delivered it to them. So although the first written record is 53 AD, Paul must have told them about it even earlier than that, even closer to the date of Jesus. But then a second important point in this passage, Paul describes himself both as an eyewitness and as a recipient of a tradition. Do you see that? He says, I delivered to you what I received. But first of all, earlier on in 1 Corinthians, he says, have I not seen Jesus? And in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, last of all, Jesus appeared to him. Now, the appearance of Jesus to Paul, sometimes it's said that that was just a vision. It wasn't a physical appearance of Jesus. But it's clear from how Paul describes the significance of Jesus' resurrection, because he goes on to say that because Jesus rose in bodily form, we will rise in bodies, that Jesus saw the physical body of Jesus. It wasn't just a vision in his mind. It was something he saw with his eyes. So Paul says he was an eyewitness, and he says he received the tradition. And if you read Galatians, one of Paul's other early letters, there he talks about the fact that after he saw Jesus, he went to meet with the other apostles. And he went to meet with them to make sure that the things that he was preaching were the same as the things they were preaching. He didn't just meet them once. He met them at least twice. Some people think perhaps 3 times. So he went back again to check it out. So this was not just an isolated person out on his own, or a couple of isolated people out on their own. These were people who did talk together, but they didn't talk together and share the message at first. Paul received it directly from Jesus. He saw Jesus, and then he checked it out. There's a third thing in this passage. Paul says there are many other eyewitnesses, and many of them are still alive. And they include Cephas, he says, that's Peter, that's another way of saying Peter's name, and James. Even the fact that Paul here uses not the name Peter, but Peter's name in his own language, Cephas, suggests his closeness to the context and his closeness to Peter. And James, who he mentions here, is James, the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus. So Paul can name Peter and he can name James, but he says that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at one time. This is not just one or two people. This is lots of people who were claiming to have seen Jesus alive at that time. In other words, you can go and find them if you really want to make the effort and talk to them yourself. And then fourthly, he says he was raised, Jesus was raised on the third day, he says, in accordance with the Scriptures. So what Paul is saying is that there is a whole backstory to the resurrection of Jesus that makes sense of why Jesus would rise again and how he would rise again. And that, of course, helps us to understand the claim that Jesus rose in a body, because that was what Jewish people understood by resurrection. So that idea of resurrection being somehow a ghostly form or a vision doesn't fit with that Old Testament background. Now, Paul is giving us a detailed account here. He's giving us a lot of evidence, and when historians have looked at this, and Gary Habermas, who's a Christian writer, summarizes this, but he has researched what even non-Christian writers are saying. He says Paul's own eyewitness testimony, the exceptionally early date when he received the creeds, these core beliefs, recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, checking his own gospel message at least twice with the chief apostles, who were also witnesses, and his knowledge of their eyewitness teaching on the resurrection appearances form a simply remarkable, interconnected trail of evidence that is virtually unheard of in ancient documents. In other words, we don't have anything quite like this in ancient documents. The strength of this evidence is amazing.